Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our 2021 legislative update. This is Mitch Kraus, Chief Operating Officer at Goodwin and Company, and joining me today is Connie Heyer with the firm of Niemann Heyer, and we appreciate everybody taking the time out to participate in what is a very important discussion on a very busy legislative season. And I know Connie was intimately involved at the Capitol, working on behalf of our clients and the association industry, homeowners association industry in general, advocating on our behalf. So thought she'd be a great person to not only offer some perspective on all of the different changes, the things that we need to know as managers, as board members, but also to give us a little background on kind of how some of this stuff came to be and offer a little bit of color. I think it's always interesting, the different things that happen during session and make that part of the discussion. So appreciate you being here, Connie, and thanks so much for joining us. And would love to have you introduce yourself and your firm to the group today.
Sure. My name is Connie Heyer. I'm with the firm of Niemann Heyer. I've been specializing in homeowners association law since I started practicing 3 years ago. No, I'm kidding. 25 years ago. And as Mitch said, my firm represents several hundred homeowners associations, and we share many clients with Goodwin and always enjoy working with them. And Goodwin, and then we both have been active, our firm, in the Texas Community Association Advocates, and I serve on the board of Texas Community Association Advocates. It is a volunteer lobby organization to advocate for the interests of homeowners association members and their associations, to try and get meaningful legislation passed and try and keep harmful legislation from passing. And we are active in reviewing bills, drafting amendments, talking with legislators. Through contributions, we hire real lobbyists whose job it is to lobby. We're just behind the scenes advising on policy and drafting bills and amendments. So as Mitch said, I was way more intimately involved than I ever expected to be this session, because no one, I don't think, could have expected what we saw this session, and that is a comprehensive omnibus bill proposed by the Texas Association of Realtors. Well, through the Texas Association of Realtors, it was their push and brainchild to get a lot of this legislation passed. Much of it perhaps well intended, but a lot of it, in my opinion at least, makes more work than would have been needed. But this is where we are, and I will be happy to give some color to some of these items that we'll discuss. And it's just like they say about legislature, it's sausage making. But mostly this is to inform you how much harder your job as board members just got, how much harder Goodwin's job as your professional manager just got, and to keep you abreast of some mandatory action items that have to be taken. So there's a lot to talk about today. I think we'll have time for questions at the end, and Mitch is going to be monitoring the chat, so feel free to use the chat, but know that we've dedicated time at the end to have questions. So with that, I think we'll just jump on in.
Yeah, and I think the big takeaway for me is, and this kind of happens with the legislature always, right, is that a lot of well-intentioned things, right, a lot of things that make sense in theory, sometimes a little harder to do in practice. And so we'll kind of talk through some of that. I think one of the things that we always see with each legislative session is that a bill is passed, and then all of a sudden there has to be clarity around that. And sometimes that's case law that provides that clarity, and other times it's clarifications through future legislative sessions that continue to build on the concept started this year. And so sometimes some gray area around what the intent of the statutory changes are, and so we just have to weed through that, and that's where we rely on our on our experts to be able to give us the insight on how to navigate it all, right? All right.
So just briefly, as far as deadlines, bill started getting filed last November. We know what we have. We know what we're working with as a certainty now because the veto deadline has come and gone. I want to say we were monitoring in terms of bills that affected HOA, well over 20 bills that directly affected HOAs and some that indirectly affected HOAs. But we're going to talk about the ones today that passed. I'll talk very briefly at the end about some near misses, just to give you some flavor of what is out there and the temperature of the legislature, and give a pitch for legislative awareness and action and hopefully participation on this part of boards, because that's very, very meaningful in influencing the legislative process, more meaningful than you could probably imagine. So first, if we want to go to the next slide, first, just a brief review. I think most of you on this call are HOA members. The only difference between a condominium and a homeowners association, and the laws do apply differently. So I'll be talking today mostly about HOA law, but there'll be some things that I'll point out, and it will be on the slide, that will be only applicable to condominiums. And a condominium is just any entity, any communal living that has shared ownership interest by the owners. So you have unit 1 out of a 100-unit condominium complex, you own 1/100th of the common element, whereas at Harris Branch or something like that, the homeowners association, which is an HOA that Goodwin manages, the homeowners association owns the common elements. So that's the only difference there. And so we'll just, but the slides will also let you know whether it's an HOA or a condominium.
I will say, for those who are feverishly taking notes, we will send, Connie has been great to prepare a really nice recap, which will expand on the concepts that we discussed today, as well as the slides, a copy of the slide deck, and we'll send that out with a copy of the recording for those of you who want to share that with fellow board members and committee members and anybody else who's interested in some of these legislative changes. That will go out as soon as that recording uploads. I'll send out kind of a post wrap-up message. As always, we also upload these to our Goodwin Company Facebook page, and under the video section, this and many other recordings, the webinars will be available, so you can easily share that with those who would be interested, and check out some of the other resources. So don't worry too much about taking a ton of notes. Know that you'll get a very detailed review, and we'll get that out to you soon.
Yes, and okay, we're ready for the next slide. So I saw a comment about the effective date. In the materials that Mitch will send out, the effective date is loud and clear. Also, everything we'll talk about today has an effective date of September 1st, except where I specifically mention otherwise. But for practical purposes, just consider everything we talk about today has an effective date of September 1st, meaning if you have to adopt a new rule or policy as a result of this legislation, it needs to be filed of record by September 1st. It doesn't mean you need to start talking about it September 1st. So the first thing we'll talk about are swimming pool fences. This is applicable to both HOAs and condos. As a practical matter, it won't be as applicable to condos other than those kind of quasi condos that really look like single family standalone homes, because it really only applies if you can build a pool in your backyard. But you can see in the slide a rendering of the kind of fence we're talking about. It's a security fence, literally a safety fence rather, it's geared towards small children. And I sat in the legislator's office with, it was very, very moving, with people who have lost children to drownings, and we're advocating for the right to put something like this around any pool. As a practical matter, it's usually going to be a fence within a perimeter fence, so it's not going to be visible. So hopefully it won't affect the aesthetics of your community, but it does mean that a rule is strongly recommended, because you can't have any restrictions on a pool enclosure fence such as this type unless you have your restrictions in writing and filed of record. And you do that, and Goodwin puts it on your website, and all the owners can see it. And what this pool yard closure fence is, your rule can establish parameters, height parameters. They can establish color parameters in your rules. The only thing you can't disallow is a black fence that's metal framed with mesh, and that's your typical swimming pool enclosure fence. We've probably all seen them, and it's just an important drowning prevention device. and it's meant to be somewhat temporary and be taken out when the kids get older. But just know that that's out there. Know that you cannot deny these fences anymore if someone brought it to your architectural committee. And it's not mandatory. The legislature didn't mandate it. But if you want to have any control over these fences, you do need to adopt a rule and file it of record.
Not something that we see get turned down very often. So
No, right.
something that I think for the most part, most of you have allow this, and I think this is just taking the extra precaution to make sure that folks aren't denied the ability to put these safety enclosures around their pools.
The next probably has the potential to be a lot more of what Mitch was referring to as the gray area. That we're going to have some growing pains with this one, and there's quite the story behind this one. The security measures bill, what it says is in a homeowners association, this is not applicable to condos. We were successful in getting condos carved out, but a homeowners association cannot prevent an owner from installing security measures on his lot. Security measures are not defined, so I suppose you could say, 12-foot hedges are security measures, but we have to have a modicum of reasonability overlaid onto this. And I'd also say that a key word is prevent. The HOA can't prevent security measures. In my opinion, it does not preclude regulating security measures. So again, you don't have to adopt a rule, but I would strongly suggest you adopt a rule basically defining what you'll consider a security measure. The law does allow you to prohibit certain things, like you can't put a camera in the common area. If this is in your rule, you can't put a camera in the common area in the name of security, because that would have been an invitation to bad things, people monitoring children at the pool and things like that. So we got that carved out. So your rules need to address the prohibition of cameras in the common areas. Your rules can regulate specifically, the statute allows you to regulate the type of fencing that the owners can install. It leaves open a lot of questions. Is front yard fencing a security measure? Probably so. But I believe it's important to have rules on the books, because you don't want one front yard fence to have a 15-foot setback and one to have a 20-foot setback and one to have a 22-foot setback. That gets into real aesthetic problems for associations. The story behind this is that there is a lobbyist that lived in an HOA that proposed a front yard fence that got denied by his HOA. He got really upset and decided that he was going to get one of his buddies to file a bill. And here we are. And this bill was passed. We really lobbied hard for more parameters on what security measures were. I don't know, does a 12-foot Bigfoot statue in your front yard, is that a security measure? Does it scare people off? We see weird stuff every day, and it's hard to convince the legislature that people will not, everything's fine if people are reasonable in their interpretation, but we know through the law of averages, how many thousands of rooftops does Goodwin manage? Through the law of averages, we're gonna get someone trying to claim something really weird in terms of security measures. So my recommendation is that you have some rules to proactively put some parameters on these security measures and impose in black and white some reasonable standards for these security measures.
I think we've got a few people wanting to clarify. Does this mean that we have to allow folks to install front yard fencing? The idea being no, so long as that we adopt a rule to address that, what measures can be taken.
Well, I do believe that you have to allow, well, I don't believe, I know that you have to allow perimeter fencing. And what does that mean exactly? And I was looking up the definition of perimeter. And so I believe that there is a case to be made. And I think let me put it this way. If you disallow perimeter fencing, I think you can expect it to be challenged. Because I think because perimeter fencing is allowed expressly under the statute, owners are allowed express right to put up perimeter fencing. And if you look up the definition of perimeter, it is basically all the way around. So I do think you're going to have to allow front yard fencing, at least if you want to not be subject to challenge. I think it's hard to argue that if owners are allowed perimeter fencing, they can't put a fencing all the way around the perimeter. But I also think because you can regulate the type of fencing, you can regulate exactly the setbacks of the perimeter fencing. I think you can regulate that it must be contiguous Like if they put up an ornamental fence that has a big gap between the front yard and the backyard, that's not a security fence. That's pretty disingenuous. So I think you can certainly impose some requirements, but this was really one of our main concerns that we talked to. We were blue in the face with legislators about, and we sent out alerts, and I know Goodwin sent out alerts to express your opinion about, if you had one, that this is going to open the door to fencing in front yards, which is an aesthetic major change for many associations, huge change, which was definitely of concern to us, but they ended up passing this in the form that you're seeing it.
This is one of those that, you know, it's going to take probably case law to clarify what the interpretation of the statute is, and, you know, to what are the limits on what can be done. I think there's a lot of questions around security cameras. I mean, can someone erect a pole in their front yard that takes video of the entire street? And you've got neighbor issues with people saying, why is there a camera pointing at my yard? I mean, all kinds of crazy things that I think we're now going to have to
No, that's exactly right. And then that's a good point with the rules. Your rules can address and should address, in my opinion, cameras. Well, we can't prevent you from having a camera, but it has to be mounted on your house. It can't be mounted on a pole in the front yard, you know, like Mitch's example, because I think we would see that potentially. It has to be, you know, it's going to spill over into neighbors' side yards typically, but it has to be for your house, and not looking into your neighbor's backyard as a primary goal of the camera, right? So all of that needs to be, in my opinion, in your rules, or else you can't do anything to regulate these cameras.
I think this is one of several scary changes that I think is going to generate a lot of discussion amongst our boards, and trying to figure out, you know, working closely with legal counsel to figure out what is right and wrong when it comes to these changes. And, you know, this is a good moment to remind everyone, and we sent out a number of different reminders. It sometimes feels like, you know, management and boards, we feel kind of outnumbered by the lobbying interests that bring some of these things to the mix, but it's exactly the reason why TCAA and CAI and others are so adamant about getting the message out regarding, you know, what this means to the associations, because it's one thing to say, hey, this makes sense, but when it starts to happen, and, you know, the idea that people can start to install burglar bars or front yard fencing, I mean, that dramatically changes the appearance of a community. And so getting to the crux of what it is that we need to do in order to contain that is going to be incredibly important, but certainly going to create some headaches for all involved.
Absolutely.
There was a question about common area security measures, and just wanted to make that very clear. This is not intended to be a common area issue. This is more specifically what a homeowner can do to prevent crime, take certain measures, and so that not something that we're referencing when it comes to, you know, the association putting cameras around common areas to provide surveillance in the community.
That's right. This is limited, and then your rules need to limit it to security measures on the owner's own lot. That's right. All right, resale certificates. This is only applicable to homeowners associations. A resale certificate is something that should be requested, and by law, the association has to produce whenever someone is trying to sell his or her home. It makes for informed buyers. You request this of Goodwin, and they give you, it takes a lot of work to put together a resale certificate. There's some illusion out there that they push a button and print out a resale certificate, you know, like a ditto machine, but it is tailored to every individual home. You know, what does this home have in terms of delinquencies, if any? What does this home have in terms of violations, if any? A lot of times there's an inspection of the home involved. It's a lot of work, and the legislature, to our great frustration, has seen fit to cap what management companies can charge. And I think that's a very bad precedent. They're going to cap what I can charge hourly and what you can charge your own clients. But this is the Texas Association of Realtors real push. They didn't want another cost at closing, even though their realtor fees represent about 2/3 of closing costs, which is ironic. But at any rate, this is where we are. And so no management company can charge more than $375 for this very involved report. And in order to which is required by law to produce, and to update it, the management company can't charge more than $75. And our pitch to the legislature was, look, everybody has to make money, everybody has to make a profit, and nobody should be apologizing for that. And if you artificially lower these fees, it's going to be made up somewhere else, typically in the form of greater fees for everybody, in the form of like the base management fee might raise for some companies, or the rush fee might raise for some companies. And so that will be, an internal decision of Goodwin, but you're not going to not make up that profit, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, when it comes to, this is something that we've already taken care of. So for those of you, this is not anything actionable on your end. It's something that we take care of on our end. And, between the fees, making sure that those are under the cap, and then managing the metrics around those requests, those are all things that we handle and do well. So from that standpoint, no worries here, not a whole lot of takeaways from this other than just to make folks aware that that's changed, but that is something that we manage, and largely you don't need to worry about.
No, that's right. Goodwin's on top of it. They've got it down to a science, the resale certificates, but it is a lot of work. And just when you see the $5,000 slide, it's something to be informed of, but like Mitch said, not anything to worry about. What that kicks in, if the resale certificate isn't produced in 10 days, then the owners can do a second request. And if it's not produced in 5 days after the second request, then they can seek a judgment for this $5,000. And that, as a practical matter, just doesn't happen. It never really comes into the fold.
Yeah, and from that standpoint, that is something that we moved about a year ago to a system called HomeWise that allows us to manage it's kind of the point of order system where a title company or buyer can go in and order the resale certificate through that system. We very closely track the metrics to make sure that we're in compliance with any of the requests, and we turn those around very quickly. So from that standpoint, that's something that we are very clear on and manage every single day, and have a large team of people that are supporting that process. A good question from one of our participants is, are resale certificates required by law? It's always a question that I get. That's something maybe would be good to expand on a little bit?
Sure. This is really a strange part of the law because they are required by law with every sale of a condominium. They are not required by law with a sale in a homeowners association. Most of the time, the title companies will require it because even if the buyer doesn't want to know what he's buying, the title company wants to know for title insurance purposes whether there are amounts due, whether there are violations. So as a practical matter, most of the time it's requested. It's mandatory on the HOA's part if it is requested, but in the buyer-seller transaction, the seller is not violating the law if he doesn't supply his buyer a resale certificate.
And I don't know how you'd want to buy a home when you're paying for everything else in that process, the additional $375 to have the disclosure documents in place that tell you exactly what's going on with that property and with the homeowners association is incredibly important. So we don't see people avoid that too often.
Right. Okay, next, y'all are all ahead of the curve on this with Goodwin because websites just became mandatory as of September 1st, again, for all professionally managed associations. Even if you're a 6-unit HOA townhome that Goodwin manages, you have to have a website. Goodwin's already got that. They're on their main website. You search for your association and your governing documents are already there. So this is a big action item for a lot of associations, but it's just not even on the radar for Goodwin managed associations because they've already proactively done that ages ago. But that's a big change for some.
Yep, already checked off the list. There you go. Management
certificates. This is not something monumental, but it is something that just has to be done on time, and it is a bit of work. So it does need to be handled pretty quickly. By the September 1st, an updated management certificate needs to be filed with the county clerk records. And what that means is the management certificate is something that is drawn up to give title companies really the contact information for the association, the name of the association, the governing document references, volume X, page Y, or document number X is your declaration. Gives them the Goodwin contact information so they can order a resale certificate. That's basically what it's for. It's a guideline to, roadmap to Goodwin so they can get this resale certificate requested. But it's just became more complicated because the management certificate now needs more information. You used to be able to have just the declaration, the primary declaration, and you didn't have to list all the amendments. Well, we have clients that have 12 declaration amendments, 18 declaration amendments. So now we're going to have to list every single declaration amendment on the management certificate, phone number and email address for the manager, the website information, which again, y'all are already ahead of the curve on, and then the amount and description of any fees related to transfer of title. And that's straightforward enough from the resale certificate and update fees because those are pretty straightforward, but this is different for every association. Some have working capital fees, some have their own transfer fees. So this is something that is going to take some lead time to get fleshed out and get tailored with your attorney. I don't know if Goodwin even wants to take this on, but I would recommend at least consulting with an attorney because in the past, it wasn't as important, but now there are real consequences for not having this information accurate. And the consequences are that you can't charge any attorney's fees to your owners who are in collection if you don't have an updated management certificate filed. And they've also imposed a dual filing requirement. You have to duplicate file your management certificate with TRAC, the Texas Association of Realtors. And just because they really didn't have a good reason for this. We think this is a foot in the door for TREC to oversee, Big Brother oversee homeowners associations and Goodwin management and, who knows, my business. We don't really know what their end game is, but it did pass and it is law that you have to file your management certificate in duplicate with TREC and with the Texas county clerk.
So this is something that certainly Connie is working to facilitate, something that we're largely going to try to handle as well. And one point to mention that is a best practice that I think everyone should take into account here, and we'll have more information out to everyone in terms of how we're going to be handling the process of managing these certificates. In fact, one of the things that we're probably going to initiate here soon is have establish a governance department or need to have some dedicated resources because now there's all these changes. And what's interesting is that every single time there's an amendment, you have to refile the management certificate. And but one thing that Connie notes, and I think is very important, is that title search is probably something, having a title company do a search to make sure that all documents are accounted for is a good, solid best practice. We're working on a solution, working with some title companies to try to have like an add-on option. It's something that will encourage every one of our communities to opt into that. If it's something that you want to avoid, it is what it is. If you want to save money, it's probably not going to be more than a couple $100s. We'll have a updated pricing structure on that soon, but it is something that we would encourage just so that that all of those documents are updated on that certificate. There's over the history of an association, when you look at we've got associations represented on this call that have been around for 40, maybe 50 years in some cases. And when you think about over the decades, all the different documents that were recorded, it is something that we've got to make sure that we have a handle on. So again, we are going to work on managing that process for you and facilitating that. And then part of that is also working with a title company to try to manage that effort and make sure that all documents are accounted for in that process.
I would absolutely encourage you to take Goodwin up on any offer of working with the title company. They are the only ones that can do a comprehensive search. And you've always had to put your declaration on your management certificate. But like I said, now the consequences are so much more significant. And now you have to have your dedicatory instruments, all of them, for two reasons. You have to have them all on your website. So if you miss one, because the developer 20 years ago didn't give Goodwin, forgot about this amendment that they had filed, if you miss one, there are real consequences. And so you have to have all your instruments on your website, and you have to have all your declaration amendments and your plats listed on your management certificate. So now there's a twofold need for all of this documentation. And it used to be that we would just put on the website, because that was just a service to the clients for Goodwin to put documents on the website. It wasn't required by law necessarily. But now with every declaration and amendment, you have to put expired amendments, like one amendment superseded another. You still have to put all of them on the website, which is silly because it's just superfluous. But anyway, the point is absolutely take them up on their offer to work with the title company, because and it's really going to be a one-time expense, because you just need a good base from which to work. And then you're going to be able to keep track of the amendments as you go along.
Yep, so more to come on that. We'll have guidance for everybody soon, but we are working on, putting the wheels in motion to make sure that everyone is compliant on that front. And if you have any questions, certainly reach out, but more information to come on that piece. There was, one thing as we jump ahead, and I saw the question, I've received the same question from other board members, is with all of these different policy changes that are required, does this mean we need to go out and get a vote of the homeowners in order to make amendments? Can you speak to that a little bit in terms of what the difference is between a resolution amendment and how that all plays?
Everything we're talking about today can be handled at the board level with your management company and HOA attorney doing their different roles. But no, this is perhaps an educational opportunity, shall we say, for your homeowners. Why all of a sudden is my neighbor's front yard fencing being approved, or why all of a sudden is our burglar bars being approved? So that's going to be an educational learning curve, I suppose. But everything we're talking about as far as mandatory or recommended adoptions of resolutions or rules, that can be handled at the board level.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you clarifying that.
That's a good question. Okay, next is really a frustrating thing that came out of the legislative session. So, and this is, again, the realtor is pushing this, and we still do not understand exactly why, but what the law now says is that if you're an HOA with more than 40 lots, your board and architectural committee have to be completely different membership base, and you can't even have a spouse or partner serving on the board and a spouse or partner serving on the ACC, which, usually if there's one, if one partner is willing to volunteer, the other partner is usually cut from the same cloth, and they're a doer as well.
Or they get roped into it because nobody else wants to volunteer, right? I mean, that's the reality of our world.
But now, and this has to happen by September 1st. If you have a board member serving on the architectural committee, or if your board is the architectural committee, you're going to have to appoint a separate committee. And I don't want to say an end around, but one creative partial solution is you could, if you have a volunteer that's willing to do work, but has a conflict because she's the wife of a board member, you could appoint a volunteer, liaison committee, and they could sit in on the architectural committee meetings and give feedback. They just couldn't vote. So just know as you work through this that there are some creative partial solutions, but the big picture is you're going to have completely separate board and ACC bodies before September 1st. And again, that's going to require some lead time. The other major change is that no matter what your documents say, there is automatic right of appeal from any architectural committee denial decision. And that appeal is on a really tight window. 30 days after receipt of the appeal, the board has to have a hearing for this owner, and either party has a optional 10-day extension. So effectively 40 days from the date you receive the letter of appeal, you're going to have a board meeting and address that. And that sounds like a lot of time until you try to get 5 or 7 board members together and schedule that. And your management company already has 5 meetings that week. And it's going to be a challenge, and it's going to be something to be worked through. But it's going to be, you're going to have to stay on top of it.
Yeah, the committee issue is one that's going to impact a lot of folks. I mean, we need to start recruiting, basically. I mean, it's going to be a full court press for many of you who are struggling to find volunteers, even to join your board. Now have to recruit a separate group of people and getting them trained up to be able to understand this. We will be working on helping you all with that. I think one of the things that I'm going to try to do here in short order is try to put together a webinar as we get closer to the September 1st deadline, so that we can start to hold little trainings and orientations for committee members on the ACC that are new to that role. We've got some pretty good tools in place through Town Square, if you haven't tried it out yet, on the ACC piece, which gives you the ability to make it really easy for people to review and vote on things. I think one of the things that we can do to bridge the gap for those boards that are saying, oh my God, how am I going to find somebody that knows as much as I do? You'll still have the ability to be an administrator on Town Square. You can see the applications as they come in, and you can, you along with us as your management team, we can coach that committee through it, or they can, through the comment section, they can offer insight. You just can't vote, right? So as long as you're not voting, being a part of the process to support that committee through a decision is probably where I'd go with that. So, maybe what you do, and I think most associations have this, you have a kind of committee liaison on the board who has already been serving as an ACC member, but now instead of a voting member, they just offer support and guidance on what we should approve or not approve. Until hopefully we've got a self-sufficient ACC committee to be able to handle that. So, we'll be there to support that as best we can. You just have to be mindful of the fact that after September 1st, you can't make a decision. You can't vote on that. And otherwise, we're going to have to figure out some alternatives. I don't know what those are, but there are questions as can you delegate that authority to somebody else, to management, to a third party firm that handles this type of stuff? And I think the answer is yes, in a lot of cases.
Yeah, you could appoint a manager to the ACC. I've heard some associations, especially those with a lot of new construction that are building out still, they're hiring architects or considering hiring architects and appointing them to the ACC. I think the trick will be whether you can actually get someone to sit on the ACC, get an architect to sit on the ACC, or if you're just going to hire that architect as a consultant, because a lot of documents already allow this, or you could adopt rules that require a fee, an architect fee with any submittal, especially of any big submittal. A lot of associations already do that, but that might be something to consider. And if you're going to consider something like that, I would get a jump on it pretty quickly. Yeah. If your rule wanted to incorporate a submittal fee to pay for an architect's review.
And it is something that, just so you all are aware, it is something that's currently being developed in Town Square, is kind of a payment mechanism for requests. So if a homeowner has a request and the association wants to charge a fee, review fee, maybe it's not for everything, maybe it's painting and things like that, that's usually something that's pretty easy to do. But if someone's installing a pool and you want to make sure that the setback requirements are being abided by, and more of the complex projects, and you wanted to hire a firm to support that effort, make sure that the committee's making the right decision, there will be something that we'll make available. More to come on this. It is something that is obviously new and is going to change a lot of the dynamics in many of our communities. And so we're working on trying to figure out different solutions. We've been entertaining the idea of, creating a team around this. It's always difficult when, it's one of those things where ACC is such a intimate part of the community, and approving something, there's so much subjectivity when it comes to ACCs that it's a difficult thing to manage. And so we're going to have more conversations around that and do what we can to support you through that. But it is something that I think we, at a minimum, please start recruiting, and we can help you with that. Get the message out to the homeowners through town square posts, through email posts. Being able to get 2-3 people on a committee would be helpful. In some cases, your documents have a specific number of folks that are to be on that committee. And so we've got to work through some of that stuff, but we'll figure it out, essentially, is what needs to be done. But that is going to change the game. I'm waiting to see the first husband and wife team that get a legal divorce, so that each one can serve and not and really support their association through this process. But I joke on that. Obviously, we don't want to see that happen, but we'll figure it out. I think it's all stuff that we're working through, and we're trying to make it even easier with the Town Square tool, the ACC Town Square tool, and making it easier for people to be involved in that process. Just hit a button to approve something, and then we'll handle the rest. But more to come on that. I think one thing, though, and we'll get to it as well, is that committee time is something that, or not committee, hearing time is going to be something that we probably just need to account for when it comes to this. And we'll talk about other hearing type aspects of board meetings, but board meetings basically need to budget some time for hearings. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the mechanics of hearings, since it's kind of a fairly new concept for many.
Yes, that's right. The board just got one more thing on its plate, and that is a mandatory right to appeal. A lot of our clients have the ACC is the final word on architectural matters, and the board doesn't have to engage with time for that, but that's just changed. So like Mitch said, you will need to be budgeting either time at your regular board meetings or a special board meeting, or it doesn't really have to be a meeting. It's just a hearing with the board.
I think, Connie, one of the things that we touched on, but I want to make clear, is that the verdict letter on a denial has to offer an alternative solution, basically. So when we deny something, you have to essentially say, you can't do this, but you can do this to gain approval.
And you click one back, and I can tell you that what the statute says. Yeah, the statute says, it's not a big deal if it's hard, but the statute says the denial letter has to tell them the basis for the denial and changes that would allow approval. And I was sitting in this legislator's office, and I said, we can't design someone's house for them, redesign their guest house or redesign the facade of their home. All we can say is, this isn't 100% masonry, or this, what have you. That wasn't a great example, but I think we're going to have to get creative in our language with changes that would allow approval. And I think that's just going to look something like, we could approve this if this were compliant with section 4.02 of the declaration. And that's probably what that's going to look like. Otherwise, you're getting into what Mitch referred to, the subjective nature of someone's design. And you don't want to tell them how to design their home to the letter. You just want to tell them, these are the parameters, and you're missing this parameter. So that's going to be a challenge. I think it's going to be fairly straightforward, but it's going to be a change in your documentation, on your architectural reviews, and especially the denials.
It's the one that gives me heartburn, because it's like, now that you see how this all blends together, right? Like, hey, you can't deny me security measures, so I want to build a moat with an alligator, and so I go and deny that approval because we can't have alligators roaming the community, and we have to give someone the alternative. So what's the alternative to that? It's a very weird thing that, man, I just wish sometimes lawmakers would sit down at the table and say, okay, how does this work, right? Like, sometimes it just leaves a lot to be desired. So trying to figure out how to navigate this all is just a little crazy.
Yep, it is. We'll get there.
We'll get there.
All right. So the notice of board meeting is more straightforward. Yay. they just increased the notice requirements for your regular board meetings to 6 days from 3 days, 144 hours from 72. Special board meeting notice hasn't changed. They did not make any changes to things that can be adopted outside of a formal noticed board meeting. There's still that same laundry list of items that you have to approve at a meeting, but except for the budget adoption. And the budget adoption, it used to be that just if you were increasing the budget, that had to be done at an open notice board meeting. Now, any adoption of budget has to be done in an open notice board meeting. And it's important to say in all of this that there is nothing that gives the owners the right to speak at a board meeting. If that were a right, those board meetings would be 6 hours long. So you can certainly entertain comments at your discretion as a board, but at some point you either don't entertain comments at all when you have to get through the agenda, and there's nothing wrong with that, or you limit everyone's comments to 2 minutes each or something to that effect. Because the board is a volunteer board. You didn't sign up for 6-hour meetings, and nobody knows more about the budget than Goodwin and the board. And the owners will nitpick the budget to death. So
I think this is probably the most reasonable statutory change. I think the addition of a few more days notice is helpful. I think it gives people more time to plan, and I think this is all done in the spirit of transparency. But certainly a budget should be something that's circulated. It impacts everyone in the community. Certainly always, generates more questions, but I would say the vast majority of our boards adopt the budget at the meeting, one that's open and noticed, and always entertain some questions around that. So I don't think much will change here. I think this is probably a good thing, something that usually we try to give as much notice as possible in advance of a board meeting, just so that people know and are aware of the opportunity to participate, even if it's just to listen in on what the board's talking about. I know that there's a lot of questions, so guys know that we will spend a little bit of time here at the end of the meeting, making sure that we address some of your questions. And if we don't, we'll know that we'll also make ourselves available to questions. There's still lots of questions around all of this. So we'll probably have some subsequent conversations on this and give you more opportunities to answer questions on the statute.
Absolutely. We're almost through the slides as well. We're almost through the Q&A. The only absolutely mandatory thing that associations have to do in terms of adopting something is to adopt a protocol that would be applicable to any job of more than $50,000. You could wait until that rears its head, but I would suggest that while you're doing these rules anyway, just adopt a protocol. My suggested protocol is very, very minimal, and that is it's something to the effect of you must make attempt to solicit X number of bids, 2, 3, etc. But if you get into details, you're just setting yourself up to fail. If you get into, we have to receive 3 bids, that sounds really good, but good luck getting someone to bid in this market. I mean, it's just hard to get someone to bid. So this is not a hard requirement. It's just something that has to get done. And you just have to follow this protocol for jobs of more than 50,000, which are pretty few and far between.
And I would say that the vast majority of boards are going through this process anyway. I mean, anytime you've got a $50,000 or more job, you're looking at what's out there and you're trying to get the best price. And I know a big part of what we do is go and chase around bids. So it's largely happening.
This is not a huge change. It's a change in terms of administrative. You send out additional notices. If your HOA uses the credit bureau reporting to help with delinquencies, you're going to have to send out additional notices. The legislature prohibited any charge from being assessed to owners for reporting their amounts due to a credit bureau. But this is really just an administrative, that you'll have to handle this administratively if you choose to report owners to a credit bureau.
And this is something we manage for those of you who are using the credit bureau protocol for delinquencies. It's something that we've seen success with, but something that we'll make sure that we're doing in compliance with the statute and making sure that we're managing that process accordingly.
This next change is also not a big change. This is an already required letter. There are no changes to the letter. It's a letter that has to get sent out before you report something to, kick it to the HOA attorney for collection, or now kick it to the credit bureau for collection. the window just became 45 days notice instead of 30 days notice. So that's just a short, quick change to an already existing letter and protocol.
Something we already take care of.
Yes, so this is also potentially not a huge change. So when an HOA identifies a violation and sends what I call a 209 letter, basically a violation letter, by law, you have to give the owners the right to a hearing to contest this violation. And what this says is anything you want to bring to the hearing to use as reference at the hearing, maybe it's all of their 12 violation letters over the last 2 years, maybe it's photos, anything you actually want to bring to the hearing to use at the hearing or reference at the hearing, you have to present to the owner at least 10 days in advance. So you have two choices. You either compile all of that paperwork and send it to the owners at least 10 days in advance, or an easier solution is to take nothing to the hearing, because everybody knows why they're there. And I'm not saying that's the better solution or worse solution, it's just an easier solution. So the point is you'll have to make a decision on protocol. Your management team can advise you on that, can help you with whatever you choose, but just know that that requirement is there. And you certainly don't want to produce anything privileged if it's heated and there's talks of lawsuits. So in some cases, you'll probably have to consult with legal counsel. I don't particularly like this because it makes it a bit more adversarial when we start talking about evidence packets, and the law now says the association must present its case first, and now the owner after that is entitled to rebut the case. This is not a mini trial. This is neighbors getting together and looking each other in the eyes and trying to, work in good faith towards a solution. My fear is that it will become a little more adversarial because they've increased the formality of this hearing a lot more. But hopefully, with the guidance of your management company, who I would definitely recommend you have in on these hearings, if not also the association lawyer, especially in heated type disputes, it's going to be a little more complicated.
Again, something that is fair, right? You always want to give somebody the due process, if you will, to say, hey, I don't agree with something. Can we talk about it? And I think that's the intent here. And it's not anything that's a major departure for the way any of us have, managed this process in the past. I think we just need to be reasonable about it, and hopefully it doesn't become as adversarial as we think it might. There's always a little bit of a possibility of that, and so the more professional we can be in managing that process, I think the better off. It's tough. Good question. Can the hearings be done virtually? I don't see any reason why they
Yes,
can't.
absolutely. All of the hearings can be done virtually.
Yeah.
Yes. Next slide is not a big change at all. Lease information, they've just outlined a statutory right to collect certain lease information from renters. And it's probably, if you collect this information, you're probably already collecting this information. And if you don't, you don't. But it just clarifies as a matter of statute what you have the right to collect. It doesn't preclude your rules requiring additional information like pets or license plates. Some associations want all owners, or all residents, I should say, to submit license plates because they have, controlled parking, things like that. So it's not really a big change. The next one is a big change as a practical matter. Everybody can always sue their HOA. Anybody can sue anyone for anything in this country, basically. So this is not a legal change per se, but it is an invitation because it's now an express statutory right of an owner to sue his association for violations of Chapter 209. And Chapter 209 is the chapter of the property code that has all these laws in it that govern HOAs, your meeting notices, your notices of violation, how to elect the board, that kind of thing. So my fear is that because this is now kind of rolling out the red carpet for a suit, the statute says you can sue your HOA, but there's nothing to prevent an owner while he's at it from suing the individual board members. And some of them, just to be ugly, do that from time to time. And that's what you have directors and officers insurance for. And so it's not the end of the world, and it doesn't happen very often. But I do think it's made it more important to review your indemnification provisions in your governing documents, because I think you, as a board member, I would want mandatory indemnification. That is, it's not optional for the HOA to indemnify you, it's mandatory. And D&O insurance just became perhaps more important, and perhaps down the line more expensive, if this does lead to more suits. But it's just one more thing to be aware of, if nothing else.
I think one of the things I was going to note is while a lot of these resolutions will be fairly easy to put in place just to make sure that you're covering yourselves, I think one of the things that I always recommend is, especially for those associations that are have been in existence for 2-3 decades, is at some point not a bad idea to have a document review done with your attorney. And Connie, I'm sure you do this quite often, but what are the things that are in the CC&Rs, and what are the things that are in the bylaws? What are the things that are covered in the documents that might be in conflict with the statutes? And I think that usually, the first thing people do is they go to their documents and then they forget that there's something that's conflicting with the statute, and the statute always wins.
Right.
So it's one of those things where it resolves a lot of confusion, a lot of conflict. I've seen it where someone's pointing to one thing and the board might be pointing to another, and then all of a sudden there's just this confusion, and you need legal counsel to kind of break the tie interpretation. But it's a good idea to at some point, especially for those of you who have been around for a while, just to go through that process. And I don't know that it has to be an incredibly expensive review, but it's something that obviously depends and takes a lot of time to make sure that you're reading through the documents. But I think it goes a long way in helping just create clarity around the documents.
It absolutely does. And the law has changed a lot in terms of HOA land. For example, you cannot prohibit someone from serving on the board or running for the board because they're delinquent. And a lot of governing documents prohibit someone from serving on the board if they're delinquent. So that's in conflict with state law. And so if you're not consulting your management company or lawyer, you might say, oh no, Johnny, you can't run for the board because you're delinquent. Well, you've just violated state law. So it does, while the legalities don't change if your documents are outdated, there's such a source of confusion or fodder for confusion. And it's absolutely worth a review. And again, it's a one-time expense, maybe every 10, 20 years. It's absolutely good practice.
I think it's one of those things, budget for it. It's one of those things where it's something to set aside a little money to do that, just like you would a reserve study. It's just one of those maintenance items that you want to make sure that you tie down, and you make sure that you got some really good sound advice from your legal counsel on how to handle some of these items.
This shouldn't affect many, if any, associations, but if you're a condominium association and your documents are fairly old, or you just want to make sure that if you're a condo association, your assessment authority is referenced in your declaration. That is really, really important, because there is a statutory right to assess in a condominium association. So some really bare bones condominium declarations are silent as to assessments because the statute gives the board the right to assess. That is not going to be sufficient anymore, that statutory right, even though it still exists. This law says you have to have it in your deed restrictions or else you can't collect assessments. In a condominium, if you can't collect assessments, heaven help you. You can't pay your light bill, much less your management company or your insurance bill or your roofing bill. So this is, if you're a condominium association, just for peace of mind, go. It shouldn't take a lawyer to do this, although this is something that we could certainly do, or any lawyer could. Just make sure the right to collect assessments is referenced in your governing documents. That's really the only thing to be done there. Ooh, religious displays. This is kind of the last big one.
Saving the best for last.
Yeah. This is already effective, and for good measure, this passed twice. Once in the big omnibus Senate Bill 1558, and once in a standalone bill. We were my volunteer lobby organization, we're very concerned about this. Not because we don't want someone to put a menorah out for Christmas or a Christmas tree in the front yard or an Easter cross in the front yard. But because we know there are wackos out there who will claim that their Nazi flag is their religion, or someone hanging from a dummy hanging from a tree is part of their religion. We've seen it, we know that it will come, and we really wanted some more proactive measures against that, but it wasn't going to happen. So the best you can do to try to avoid kind of the offensive displays is to adopt a rule with some parameters, because it's just like what we talked about before. You can't prohibit religious displays, but prohibiting is different than restricting. So what I have in mind is a rule that has some location parameters, like it has to be within X feet of the front door. It can't be on the roof. And if you don't have to adopt a rule, but if you don't adopt a rule as a board, if you don't adopt a rule like this, you could get, just throwing out a really ridiculous example, but you could get a Nazi flag on the roof, or something really problematic on the roof. And it's just better to try to avoid that proactively. And the statute says you can prohibit offensive things, but it says you can prohibit offensive things other than due to religious content. And someone determined to put a Nazi flag up is going to say, well, that's religious content. So it would be better to have, if there's going to be a crazy Nazi flag, have a size restriction, have a location restriction. Hopefully it's not very visible. And it also just with any religious, whether it's well, actually, we're not talking about seasonal holiday decorations. That's different. And we can be more expansive with that in the rules, and my standard rules would be. But we're talking about year-round permanent, religious displays. If somebody wants to put a cross in their front yard year-round, it would be within X feet of the front door. It would be less than 5 feet tall, or whatever size restrictions you decide on. Otherwise, and I've seen it, and I'm sure Mitch has seen it, you get what many would consider weird stuff. I mean, there's nothing wrong, and it's a beautiful statue of the Buddha, but I've seen a 12-foot Buddha in someone's front yard, and the neighbors, it's not particularly great for resale around it. So we're just trying to keep the aesthetics relatively uniform, while still not prohibiting these religious displays that are now everyone's right.
Yep, this is going to be an interesting one.
It is.
There are some questions around, can you create time limits for when people can put this out? But the reality is you can't. You've got to allow someone to express their, to display their religious article, if you will, but you can't contain it to a certain period of time, to a holiday or something of that nature. To Connie's point, it's creating a set of guidelines around what you can put, and maybe limit the size of it and the location of it to be a point that doesn't get out of control. I mean, you're just trying to contain this at this point. It's there's a lot of questions around define religion.
Right.
Boy, that's a tough one, isn't it?
Well, that's going to be, and that the questions you're asking are exactly the questions we pose to the lawmakers. And who are we to judge that the Jewish religion is better than the Nazi religion? I mean, obviously, that's obvious to anybody, but we would be going to court literally to argue against someone determined to argue that Nazi is their religion. And I'm picking on the Nazis, but I think it's a pretty easy target to pick on. Yeah, but this is really a gray, it's a black box. And one of the examples I used was, I've got a neighborhood that has probably a 10-foot Sasquatch in the front yard, and he's trying to claim that this is some part of his alternate religion. And we don't want to be the religious police and tell you your beliefs are more valid than your beliefs. That's not the HOA's job, but we've kind of been put into that role, unfortunately. So I think the bottom line is, with the really weird stuff, we're going to have lawsuits about it, about claiming, no, that's not a sincere religious belief. No, that's not a religion. Because if someone is determined to put something weird up, we can't just go take it. We would have to file a lawsuit to get the court to require its removal.
I saw a funny comment. I think Texas A&M and UT might
Become
some
religion.
folks might become a religion. So we might see
No,
some
that's a
football
genuine
tournament during
religion.
football
Okay.
season. That'll be an interesting one. No,
That's
it
funny.
is. I mean, it's just one of those things where you just kind of scratch your head and say, okay, how do we deal with this? And you know, I think the big thing, guys, is and we deal with this with everything, any of these sensitive issues. We just went through it, you know, during election season, and we saw it, you know, with some of the signage that folks wanted to display, pointing to whatever item, issue, movement they're passionate about. In all cases, I always use, and I tell our team this all the time, if it could end up on the front page of the newspaper or national news, which HOAs typically do, and this is why we kind of have some of this legislation, is somebody takes a story and runs with it. Seek counsel, right? I know some of you are dealing with limited budgets, and your cash flow is tight, and always always sensitive to that. But when you put the association in a position where you are now in violation of the statutes and what folks can or cannot do, it takes a few minutes of someone like Connie's time to weigh in on something and give you some guidelines. And she's always been instrumental with any sensitive situation on how to word something or do something that, even if it does become a news story, at least it was written in a way that that most people would say that's reasonable. And I think that's what we're all after. So just be cautious with this. We'll have conversations around it as it happens. It's going to happen. People are going to test the limits. Hopefully this doesn't get out in the world and everybody knows I can go start, planting whatever I want on my front lawn. But it is something that we just have to be conscious of.
Yeah. Pretty much at the end, discriminatory provisions, I put this, it doesn't apply. Just know that it doesn't apply to HOAs or condos. There was some talk in the beginning about homeowners having the right to remove discriminatory provisions from deed restrictions. I've never seen a discriminatory provision in a declaration. And we were worried that people would argue, oh, well, I have lower income and this is discriminatory to make me pay assessments. And we just didn't want to go there. But anyway, the way it passed, it's only related to conveyance instruments like a deed. And I have seen really awful misguided language in deeds that absolutely should be struck from deeds, saying what race of a person can live there or what sex of a person can live there. And that is what right a homeowner got. If that kind of racist or sexist, et cetera, language is in a chain of title, now the homeowners have a tool to physically remove that from their chain of title, which is great, but it does not apply to your HOAs or condos. The next slide is, if you have a community where you have a commercial property within your community, and some of them do, not very often, but you have to amend your declaration by the process outlined in your declaration. The statute says an alternative process is 67% of all owners, but that way the residential owners could gang up on the commercial property and affect the commercial property. So that really shouldn't affect many people, just know it's out there. The last big thing is in condominiums, this is only applicable to condominiums because this is already a requirement for HOAs, and HOAs adopted this same rule 6 years ago. You have to adopt a record production and copying policy, and you have to adopt a document retention policy. And these are mandatory for condos filed of record by September 1st. And it's not a particularly complicated rule because the statute pretty much outlines what it needs to say, but it does have to be filed of record by September 1st. And this means an open notice. Well, this is a condo, so it's not necessarily an open notice meeting, but it is a board meeting or unanimous consent of the board to get this done. So it is going to take a little bit of lead time. For the larger communities that have golf carts driving around in them, yay, you don't have to have a license plate anymore. This was fixing an error, an inadvertent definition from last session that nobody meant to make golf carts have street legal license plates. So if you were worried about that, you don't have to worry about that anymore. You don't have to.
We should definitely limit the age that kids can be driving golf carts around.
You know, we
That
actually
is
tried
crazy.
to float that balloon and say you had to have a driver's license to drive a golf cart, because that is the bane of some existence sometimes. But no, that didn't fly.
I'm amazed in my community. There's like 10-year-olds driving golf carts by themselves, no parents. I'm like, wow.
It's a little unsettling.
Yeah.
And then just a couple of near misses. I just wanted to inform you, this is the climate, and this bill almost passed. A bill that would have allowed everybody to use every square foot of their yard, including their front yard, for cottage food production, which is a great intent, sustainable, live off your own land. But I don't think you want to look next door and see a weedy carrot patch right by the front sidewalk. And raising or keeping 6 or fewer chickens. Great if you've got a large lot and that's what you bought into, but some people really don't want chickens. Some people, their lots are not conducive to it. And then 3 beehives. Well, what about the kid next door that's deadly allergic to bees? This almost passed, guys. And we made all of these arguments. The Texas Municipal League, which is a very prestigious, lobby group that is compiled of city representatives, opposed this bill, and it still almost passed. There is not a lot of reason in some instances in the legislature. And this was a case in point. So
this will be back.
This will be back. We have a chicken bill every session, it seems like, but now the chicken bill has grown into a chicken and carrot and rabbit and beehive bill. And then the last thing that was a near miss that I wanted to point out would have been a really onerous rule with regard to fines. There was a bill that wanted every homeowners association, which fines, and fines are important. People get, bristly about fines, but without fines, you have 2 options. You do nothing or you file a lawsuit. And lawsuits are really expensive and they're very adversarial. So fines are really the only middle ground compliance tool that you have. And so this would have required you to adopt a rule to disclose each type of violation. That's a really long rule, each type of possible violation and the amount of fine for each violation. It would have been very administratively hard to draft, to implement. It didn't pass, but just again, letting you know the climate. And then just a couple of slides, proactive measures going forward. It was so valuable. If we know, if Goodwin knows, if TCAA, my firm knows, if you're active in the political process, if you are good friends with a legislature or a staffer or volunteer for their campaign, it is so meaningful to have that contact, because we can say it till we're blue in the face, but we're tainted because we're in the industry. You are much more effective than we are in advocating for yourself. So please let us know if you'd like to get involved.
I blame that Geico commercial with the lady chopping down the mailbox. I think this is what got us in this spot, right? I mean, there's like this hate on HOAs, and it's like, hey, we're just trying to keep things peaceful here and aesthetically harmonious, if you will, and a lot of bad rap, but we are outnumbered. And I think to your point, I think one of the things that I'd love to do with your help, Connie, is let's create a little membership drive here, because I think many of our board members, just because something was enacted this year doesn't mean we can't erase it in 2 years. Absolutely. Right? I mean, it's something that, as there's real stories around the trouble that this has caused, either creating clarifying language or limiting some of the power of some of these items is something that we all have to do as a group, right? And so we can bark as loud as we can, but until we come together as a group and become as formidable as those that are putting this into play, it's going to be really hard. And it's a very small participation rate in terms of those that are actually seeing it. But it takes a year like this to say, hey, some of this stuff is incredibly unreasonable, and here's what it's costing us as a result of it. So we'll get some of that membership information out to those who participated today, and let's see if we can get some folks together. We were very fortunate, and Connie, there's a shout out to some of our board members who participated in some of these hearings and offered the perspective of board members and communities that, what you're proposing is crazy. And big thanks to all of those who participated in those conversations and those discussions. It's important that they know that outside of a management company. There are real volunteers here that are just trying to do their best to serve their community. And we're doing things that are making that job a heck of a lot more difficult.
That's right. And that's a good segue into the next slide. And the next slide is really, it's nothing to really discuss. It's just a summary of everything we've talked about. This is a lot of things. This is only, you know, the first slide of a summary of action items. And these have made your jobs more complex, Goodwin's job more complex, and my job more complex. Some of it's very meaningful and reasonable, and some of it is going to be a real challenge. And
again, as this list gets a little overwhelming, know that you've got help. Okay, so whether it's, you know, if you're working with Connie or your legal counsel, everybody's working down the same path to make sure that you have what you need in order to be compliant. So believe me when I tell you, you have my commitment that we are going to be working with every single one of our managers. We've got a checklist of all the items that need to be in play for every community. We'll be providing more updates on, you know, the options that are available to you in order to get this done. So you've got help coming. This isn't something where, you know, we drop this on you and then all of a sudden you're here to figure it out. Our team is working very diligently to make sure that every single one of you have what you need. This is, I liken it to passing a budget. We got to pass a budget. There's very few things that you have to do as an association every year. You know, passing that budget is an important one. This is an important one, right? Really just making sure that we all, you know, check some of these boxes and make sure that you're compliant. So we're working on it. Expect more communication on this. It's something that we're going to continue to train our people on. And you've got professionals like Connie who are also here to help guide you through that process. So more to come. This whole checklist is going to be included in the update that we send out after this call. Connie's done a phenomenal job of putting a summary together of all the different items. And it's something that we'll add to every one of our board meeting agendas. In you know, any of you who have an agenda that you're putting together for the next board meeting, this needs to be an item, right? We need to have a conversation around what we need to do. I will tell you, it's going to take some dollars, right? Fortunately, everyone of the legal professionals, including Connie that I've spoken to, has put together, you know, some good options. We're working on some things to make the, you know, management certificate filing and all of that stuff very easy and efficient to do. But it is going to take time to put that together and adopt that. And for our board presidents out there or secretaries, we're going to need to come meet with you to sign and get stuff, you know, filed. So more to come on this, but know that I don't want everybody to get overwhelmed when it comes to you know, what these changes are and how to get it all done by 9/1. We're all scrambling to make it happen.
we'll make it happen. The most important thing that you can do, you're already doing right now, and that is get educated and understand why these things need to happen. And Goodwin and people like me are going to actually make it happen with your vote and signature. But this is the best thing you can do, and you're doing it. So good for you. So like you said, you'll get a checklist, you'll get a summary of you'll get a detailed summary and then kind of a quick reference summary. This is just to reiterate these are a lot of action items that Goodwin and people like me are taking care of for you, but just know that they have to get done. And this is why they have to get done. And the next slide is just the condos. There's not as many action items for condos, but they are important because those two are absolutely mandatory. And then that's it, other than I wanted to mention TCAA again, my legislative advocacy group that I serve on the volunteer board of. Goodwin helped us get a Goodwin board president. It's a client of Goodwin's and mine. The board president sits on TCAA. We would love to have more homeowner participation on our board and advisory committees.
Yeah.
Yay, Kevin. Crystal Falls, yay. But it's a really great organization, and we encourage you to consider making it a part of your annual budget as a TCAA contribution, because it is the only advocacy group advocating for your homeowners' rights, for reasonable legislation, and we rely on contributions, period, the end. And that's it. Q&A time.
Yep. All right, how much time do you have?
No, I've got all the time.
All right,
Let's see.
let's try to get through some of the questions. And again, we're going to do the best we can to get through. There's a lot of questions coming through this. And again, more to come on this, guys. This is,
I probably have 10 minutes actually.
Okay, we'll do more.
Gotta catch a plane, I'm sorry, or else I'll be
Okay,
here all day.
I'll tell you what, Connie, why don't we also schedule a follow-up for maybe some open Q&A
Sure,
that we
that'd
can
be
do?
great, yeah.
And then what we'll do is I will take the questions that came through the chat, and maybe we can work together on putting, making sure it's addressed in some of the
That's a great idea. Let's
from-
save this
Yeah.
draft and make sure those get addressed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. They probably are already addressing it, but that'd be great.
Yes. So more to come on this. We'll probably, for the sake of not angering anybody who's on this call and making sure that we get to everybody's questions, let me take these back and we'll address those, and we'll come up with a follow-up webinar for kind of an open Q&A session and try to make that work. Also, please stay tuned for those of you who boards who are interested. We are going to make a push to also have some in-person training. And we're going to do that out of our new office in Austin. We're going to try to bring that to every market that we serve. So your local Goodwin and Company office will also have some in-person opportunities to come in and participate in some of this training. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation and for just taking the time to learn all of these different things that are impacting the association. Again, we got this. We're going to get through this. We're going to weather the storm. There's going to be some adjustments that need to be made, but ultimately we'll work through it together. Let's try to get through some of these real quick. If we've got the next 5 minutes. I think we've got the effective dates. Some questions around the front yard fencing. I think we've probably generated a lot of questions, but maybe we can just kind of touch on that one just a bit. So the big thing that you're proposing is that we put together some guidelines around what is permissible in terms of security measures. Is that the idea?
Yes. What the law says is very open-ended. And somebody said, why did I discuss burglar bars? That's just an example. The law is open-ended, and the law says that HOAs cannot prevent an owner from installing security measures on his lot. So what we want to avoid is owners claiming something silly in the name of a security measure. I don't think a burglar bar is probably silly. I think that is a straight up security measure. So I don't think you can prohibit those anymore. That's why I kind of picked on burglar bars as an example, because that is a security measure. I mean, that's what they're for, burglar bars. It kind of is in the name. But there are some other, but you could impose parameters on those, like they have to be of X material, or certainly you could say that any security measure has to be brought before the architectural committee, and the architectural committee can consider materials and color and aesthetics, but all that needs to be in a rule in order for you to be able to have that kind of control. Otherwise, the statute says you cannot prohibit them. So really you need to have, and my advice is to have a rule on the books to put some brackets and some definition on what will be considered a security measure, what we can take into consideration in approving them with conditions. Okay, you can have those burglar bars, but they have to be black. They have to be this design. We're approving one design for the entire community, for example. Then that you don't have to do that, but just to have some modicum of control, you do need to adopt.
So let's talk about a real one. And I think the example that everybody points to is, okay, I want to install a white picket fence around my front yard. Mm-hmm. Is there anything to stop me from doing that now?
Not right this minute, but what I would suggest is you adopt a rule as your HOA, and you say, if you want any fencing in the front yards, this is where it has to be, and decide on a consistent setback. Or maybe it's case by case, probably better it's case by case, but you have the right to dictate the setback in your rules. You have the right to dictate the material. Like, you don't want to pick a fence here and a wrought iron fence here, and you want to probably prohibit chain link, certainly in the front yard, certainly. So all of that, in my opinion, should be done in a rule. And it doesn't have to be a super, super detailed rule, but the rule does need to say, we have the right to dictate the material and the location and things like that. It's just important to kind of stake out that right in black and white in order to maintain your ability to impose these parameters on these security measures.
And again, this does not stop, I mean, this is permitting homeowners to install security measures. This does not prohibit the association from taking measures for security purposes in common area of the association.
Right.
So for some reason, we got a lot of questions about that. So I just wanted to make that clear again. So more to come on that. And that's one of those that we're going to have to dig into a little bit more to make sure that we've got, and I don't know how boilerplate that can be in terms of just the aesthetic qualities. It's probably going to take some conversations around what we need to do in order to make that happen. There's probably something that we can do to minimally get us there and create some parameters, but probably worth the conversation.
I think it can be fairly boilerplate, but what I would suggest is for you to make decisions as a board to proceed with me or another firm in helping you with this, because we'll give you what we suggest as a template and you might give us feedback to tailor it to your specific desires, and we'll have to have a discussion whether that's doable under the law, which won't take a ton of time, but it will take some time. So the more lead time we have for this, the more we can tailor these rules. And most importantly, we'll get something on the books by September 1st. And if we tweak it as we go along later, that's fine.
Does the definition of declaration amendments also include changes to bylaws and the rules promulgated by the HOA?
No, so you're talking about the management certificates, I believe, and the declaration, and all declaration amendments have to be listed. Their recording information has to be listed on the management certificate. No, thank goodness, you do not have to list on your management certificate bylaws or rules.
Mm-hmm. And this is something to be clear that on the management certificates, we're working on a solution to just get those filed. It's not something that you have to manage on your own. A lot of questions around security fences.
Yep.
Certainly a lot of questions around what's going to stop one homeowner from shining their camera on another homeowner. We'll have to cross that bridge when it comes.
Your rules is the short answer, and your approval process, which needs to be outlined in your rules. Mm-hmm. We'll get there, but those are all really valid concerns.
There's a couple questions related to declarant controlled boards. In all cases, they are managing the ACC process. Does this mean that they now have to create a committee?
No, and I should have said that, and it might have been on the slide and I skipped it, but this is the architectural committee being separate from the board. That requirement is not applicable during the development period.
Question, and this will probably show up more often than not. Bylaws say something to the effect that the ARB must be a board member or have a board member who chairs it or something where there's some kind of representation from the board. So essentially those are now bye.
Yep.
And that's where we go back to probably a good time to start talking document reviews.
About the liaison, because that, in my experience at least, it's very valuable to have board input into the ACC, because those two bodies need to know what the others are doing. And I strongly, especially if you have an active ACC, encourage you to think about a liaison type, advisory committee or liaison.
Let's see, we got a bunch of always get a question. We mentioned DNO, always get questions about DNO. And so a specific question, and it's probably a good one. Does DNO insurance cover board and committee members as individuals? Do board and committee members have to obtain personal insurance guarding against being sued individually due to board actions?
So the typical, I'm just going to answer what the typical policy looks like. The typical DNO policy covers board members, committee members. So that's why you want a formal, that's why I suggested a liaison committee, because you just don't want to say, okay, Johnny is now appointed as liaison to the architectural committee, because what is that? But in your DNO policies, you're usually going to see this policy covers agents of the association sued in their capacity as agents, sued for something they did as far as in their role as agent of the association. And they'll specifically list, for example, officers, directors, committee members. So I want to be someone in that list. You want to be a committee member, officer, or director, so there's no question that you're covered. So that, I don't see that as particularly a challenge. It's just a matter of the words you use to appoint that liaison. And I would appoint, you don't want to say the liaison is on the architectural committee, because he's not supposed to be on the architectural committee. You want to say you've established a liaison committee to work with the architectural committee, which is kind of ridiculous, but it's just what we have to do.
Good question, just about the mechanics of filing. So anything or recording, so anything that we do regarding resolutions, just clarity around any of these, the output of these changes will be recorded with the county, right? So with anything that you do, if there's anything that's going to be in full effect and is going to be something that the board points to as a rule or a decision, those items are recorded just to make sure that they're enforceable.
Yes, filed of record with official public records, deed records. They have real property records. It has a lot of names, but it's all the same thing. In where you would record the deed and the mortgage to your house.
Yep. All right. So great suggestion from Ron is to create, publish an FAQ. Yes. So we're going to have some really good stuff for you. And then that's a great idea. I'll put together some FAQ type material. There's a lot more we need to do with regards to this. I know you've got to catch a plane. So
yeah, we'll brainstorm on questions, and I think we could have a separate standalone FAQ.
Yeah,
I think that's a great idea,
I
with topic by topic.
I think as you guys have conversations, we'll have another session. We'll make it an open type Q&A, and we'll just answer your questions.
Sounds great.
All right. Well, thank you all.
Thank you for being here.
Happy Friday. Have a great weekend. And thank you so much for participating in our webinar. Talk soon.